Well, hi, guys. So you probably noticed Bailey up here the last few weeks doing an awesome job leading worship. Let's give him a round of applause. He has become a very good worship leader. And so you've also noticed that Pastor Jason has not been here the last few weeks. That's because he has been in Israel. Yeah, he's been in the country of Israel. We're going to take a minute as we start the message today to talk about the nation of Israel, because it is a remarkable fact that that nation even exists. Now, the Jewish people today are the direct descendants, biologically speaking, of the people that we've been talking about in this sermon series over the last while. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and today we're going to talk about Joseph. And for a long time, the Jewish people have been in Israel and out of Israel. In the Bible stories, they go to Israel, they leave Israel, they go to Israel, they get kicked out of Israel again, the country, the area that I'm talking about now, the promised land. And then after the Bible, what happens is the Romans come, after sort of the New Testament ends, the Romans come and remove them again. It's a long history, and we're not going to go through the whole thing. But for a long time, this was a problem for people who believed that the Bible was true and that what God said in the Bible would eventually happen. And many people who thought the Bible wasn't true during the Middle Ages, and then even after the Middle Ages, the early modern period, they thought the Bible, the prophecies in the Bible can't possibly happen. They can't be true because there are many places in the Bible when it talks about Jesus returning, promises that were given to the people of Israel that are clear that they will live in that particular country, in that piece of land, until Jesus returns. When he returns, they're going to be there. And for a long, long time, something like 1,000 years, they were hardly there at all. They were scattered all over the world. They were all over Europe. And so many people said and argued the Bible can't be true because the Jewish people aren't there. And then, of course, amazingly, in 1948, after the end of World War II, let's put that picture up on the screen. In 1948, the nation-state of Israel was established again. And Jewish people, they had actually been returning for a little bit before that. They began returning and are still returning in some ways en masse to Israel. And now there is a nation, a physical nation of Israel in that location, just as the Bible had predicted. When this first happened, many people, there were cartoons, newspaper headlines at the time in 1948 that basically said, well, let's go read the Bible to find out what happens next. Because this is something the Bible had predicted that nobody thought could happen. And now it's just a fact in the world around us. God will fulfill his promises. The things that he says, sometimes they take what seems like to us to be a long time to come true. But to him, a long time is very different. And he is ruling over all the different things that people are doing. We're going to see that today as we go through the story of Joseph. We're in a sermon series called Heroes of Faith, and we're looking at, in Hebrews chapter 11, this is a letter that was written to some people who were about to give up on following Jesus because it was too hard. This is a letter that was written to them to encourage them to keep going in their faith. And in this letter, in the 11th chapter, there's this list of people, all in the Bible, in the earlier history of the Bible, who did great things because of their faith in God. And we're looking at each one of those people, and then we're taking a look and saying, okay, what kind of faith did they have? What did faith look like for this particular person? How did they live out their faith, and what was the result? And so we've been looking most recently at Abraham and then at Isaac and Jacob. Last week we looked at the idea of Isaac and Jacob blessing their children, blessing the next generation, because they trusted that God's power was there in their lives to do that. And today we're looking at the story of Joseph. And Joseph, if you know his story, this is a story we could probably do 5 or 6 messages just on the story of Joseph. So we're going to be here for about 4 hours today. No. We're just going to spend a little bit. We're not going to go through every detail of his life. but we're going to look at some major themes from his life. So let's start out looking at what Hebrews 11 says about him, what the writer of Hebrews thought was the great thing of faith that Joseph did. He did lots of amazing things through his faith. But in chapter 11 of Hebrews, in verse 22, here's what the writer of Hebrews says that he did. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, he spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. That's a great act of faith. It is a great act of faith, and we'll see what that looks like in just a minute. First, we need a little bit of an outline of Joseph's life. So let's do that by watching a short video clip. This is the Bible Project video. We've been watching little pieces of it, and you'll see an outline of some of what happens in Joseph's life. Let's watch that right now.
So Jacob goes on from there to have 12 sons, big family. But Jacob loves his 11th son, Joseph, way more than all others. And so he gives him the special Technicolor dream coat. And his brothers, because of this, come to hate him.
So much so that they plan on killing him.
But they don't. They instead just sell him as a slave down in Egypt.
Now, while in Egypt, through this crazy series of events, Joseph goes from being in a prison cell to becoming the second in command there.
And so later on, the whole Middle East falls into this food shortage. And Joseph's brothers, they come down to Egypt looking for food. And then when they get there, who should they find as the ruler of the whole land?
It's Joseph, that guy sold in slavery. But he actually saves them starving to death.
And so here you have it. These are the great-grandchildren of Abraham who have done this heinous act to their brother, but God has transformed their evil into something good.
And that's exactly what Joseph says here in the last paragraph of the entire book. He says, you guys planned all of this for evil, but God planned it for good to save people's lives.
Now these words, they conclude the book because they actually summarize the message of the whole story so far. Humans keep choosing evil, and we are thinking they're screwing up God's plan, but he keeps turning their evil back into good. And somehow, he's going to use this family to restore humanity back to the garden.
Isn't that a great video? Short summary of Joseph's life. Let's spend a little bit more time talking about what his life looked like, and then we'll draw out two main points from his life. One will be about a big idea called God's sovereignty. But don't worry, we won't only use that word. We'll use some more normal words to understand it. And the other will be about how did Joseph endure through all of this. All right, so we've seen the outline of his life. Remember, Joseph is one of Jacob's kids. We talked about Jacob last week. So Joseph is one of the great-grandchildren of Abraham, who was given this promise by God that if he wandered off into the wilderness, God would lead him into a new land that would be his, and God would make him into a great nation, lots of people, and then God would bless the whole world. God would help everyone in the world who's trapped in all this darkness and fighting and evil through this family eventually. So then you had Abraham, you had Isaac, then you had Jacob, and now Jacob has 12 sons. And we talked about and just saw again in that video, what's the word we've been using to describe this family that God chose to bless the whole world? The word is dysfunctional. Yes, they are faithful. There is a part of them that really wants to follow after God and wants to have a relationship with him. They want to know God, but they are dysfunctional. They are always messing things up. And you can see that very clearly in Joseph's life and in the lives of his brothers and his family as he grew up. So there's 12 kids in the family, right? And just like had happened in Jacob's family, so Jacob is the dad of the family now, when he grew up, one parent had favored one kid and the other parent favored the other child. Well, the same thing is repeated, or very similar. Jacob favors Joseph above all his other kids. He favors Joseph the most, and he does this in really clear ways. Right back then, he gives him a special jacket to wear, a special coat that's really, really awesome. Now, I know that might not seem like much to us, but to them, this was a big deal. This is like we bought Joseph a Ferrari, and everybody else is taking the bus. That's what's going on here, all right? So you can imagine, and Joseph is one of the youngest, right? He's not the youngest of the 12, but he's one of the youngest. So Joseph has got brothers who are like in their late 20s and 30s. They never got a car from dad. And now Joseph, as soon as he turns 16, he's got a Ferrari. So what do the other brothers feel like? And this has been going on his whole life. Dad has always favored Joseph. And in fact, Dad says things like, Joseph is my favorite child. I love him more than you. Okay? So this was not just subtle. This was really clear. Well, this is a dysfunctional family. This messes up the family. So obviously these brothers are always fighting as they grow up, like all brothers do. But this becomes more and more. Then on top of that, what happens is Joseph starts having these dreams. And in the dreams, we won't go into the details, but in the dreams, the rest of his family is bowing down to him and serving him. And Joseph, he has learned some things. Now, there is actually, I want to point out, some progress in this early family. Joseph becomes a man who is very, very honest in his life. He has high integrity. We're going to see that in a minute. He's very, very honest. And his parents, his dad and his grandfather and his great-grandfather were not very honest. They were guys who, when things got tough and they got scared, they lied to get out of situations. We saw that in the earlier stories. So there has been some progress, and I think actually Joseph has learned this from his dad. His dad has learned the hard way that you need to be honest and follow God's way and trust God. And Joseph has learned some of that. So there's a big part of Joseph that wants to follow after God. And he gets this dream from God that he's serving God and his family is coming and bowing down to him. And so he goes and tells his brothers this dream. Man, this is a horrible move, Joseph. He goes and tells his brother, hey guys, I had this awesome dream. And in the dream, you guys were all bowing down and serving me. And I was the king. I was the big boss. And he's the one with the Ferrari, remember? So his brothers, they want to kill him. And one of his brothers, who's sort of the Lion of Judah, actually. We sing that song, right? The Lion of Judah. Well, Judah was one of the brothers, and he was kind of like a lion. He was aggressive and strong. And Judah says, this guy needs to die. Let's kill him. And the other brothers are like, no, let's just sell him as a slave. So they sell him as a slave, and Joseph gets taken down to the country of Egypt. And he's there for a long time. While he's in Egypt, a bunch of stuff happens. What happens is his integrity starts to come out. Joseph is actually trying to follow God, and this is kind of amazing. He's in Egypt. He's sold as a slave. He becomes a slave of a high Egyptian official, and he is really good at what he does. Instead of having a bad attitude and thinking, oh, God's abandoned me, and my life is awful, and just trying to get by, Joseph actually works really hard in Egypt. He continues to pray to God, to seek after God, and his honesty, his integrity, his character, and God doing things through him are noticed by his master. And he rises in the ranks as a slave in this household until eventually he's put in charge of the whole household. And this is a big deal. This is like being put in charge of a business today, actually. The household of an Egyptian official. He's put in charge of it because he's really competent, and the master knows that he can trust Joseph. He can see that Joseph is a man of honesty and integrity. Well, then, of course, what happens is through a series of events, the master's wife tries to get Joseph to be with her, and Joseph won't do it. Again, high integrity. But she frames him, and he gets thrown in prison. Well, still, while he's in prison, so all these difficult situations come into Joseph's life. He seems like he's doing the right thing. He feels like, I'm trying to follow God. And you could see how Joseph might think, well, I'm following God. Why are all these bad things still happening to me? I was honest. I did the right thing. Even though I'm a slave in Egypt, I'm still praying. I'm still serving God. And now I'm thrown into prison after I had risen in the ranks to a very high level. And he's in prison for a long time. He's in prison for a long time, but still in prison. Joseph is able to continue trusting God somehow. He continues praying to God. He continues trying to help the people around him. He does not just focus on his own situation, think, oh, it's so sad. My situation is so horrible. No, he actually tries to help the other people who are in prison. A situation comes up where some prisoners who were officials with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, one of them had been thrown in prison, a couple of them had been thrown in prison, and they have dreams, and Joseph, as he's praying, God shows him what their dreams mean. And he's able to help one of these officials actually get out of prison. The official then forgets him, and Joseph is left in prison for a long time again. Eventually, through another series of events, he's called to interpret a dream for Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now, he's been in prison for a long time at this point, over a decade. He's been in Egypt for we don't know how long. But after trusting God for all this time, he finally interprets this dream in front of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh makes him the second in command of the entire nation. That's what we saw up there at the top. Now, a little piece of information about Egypt and the ancient Middle East that you need to know at this time. You'll see that in these stories in Genesis, we've already seen Abraham once went to Egypt when there was a food shortage. And the reason is because at that time, there was no irrigation anywhere in what we would think of as Israel and the countries around it today. There was no kind of irrigation. They just grew plants by whatever water came from the sky. And so if it didn't rain for a long time, guess what happened? All the plants died, and they didn't have any food. But in Egypt, they had irrigation because the Nile River would flood really regularly. Every year it would flood, and they would dig canals that would water their fields. And so when everybody else had no food, guess who had food? Egypt had food. And this is why we see people going to Egypt again and again when they run out of food in the Bible, in Genesis. And so the dream that Joseph had interpreted for Pharaoh was all about what was going to happen with the rain and the weather over the next 14 years in Egypt. There's going to be 7 years where there's tons of food because there's great water, the river's going to flood, everything's going to be great. But then there's going to be 7 years where there's not very much food. And so we need to store the food from the first 7 years so that we can feed our people for the second. And that's actually what happens. Joseph is put in charge of this, and he administers this for the entire nation. Now, you can see that this is getting set up for how his family is eventually going to come down and be put, what his dream that he had when he was a kid is eventually going to come true. And that's really important to notice. So eventually, his brothers, they are up there in the land of Canaan in Israel, and they run out of food, and so they say, let's go to Egypt and see if we can find some. And when they go, they find out Egypt has all this grain, and they find their brother Joseph. They find him down there. There's a whole story there. Joseph kind of messes with them for a long time. It's actually pretty funny as Joseph messes with his brothers because they don't recognize him at first, which you could imagine because he's wearing like Egyptian stuff, as we saw in that video. He doesn't look like Joseph did before. But eventually he reveals himself to them, and they're freaked out and thinks he's going to kill them or do something really bad to them, but he doesn't. He forgives them because he sees how God has worked through this whole series of events over a long period of time, maybe 30, maybe 40 years. God has been at work even though human beings were making all kinds of choices on their own. Some of those choices, many of them were really bad. Some of them were good. But over all of it, God was at work. And that's the point of the story. And that's what we're going to see in a minute. Joseph was able to see at the end of his life. And he was able to trust. And that's what the writer of Hebrews calls this great act of faith that Joseph had at the end of his life. So let's think about for a minute. So the first point there for your bulletins, if you want to write it in, is believe that God will fulfill his promises. Believe that God will fulfill his promises. That is a critical moment, a critical element of faith. Often God shows us something. He leads us in a certain direction. We take a step of faith to follow him, but then things get really scary. It looks like there's no way that this could work out, this thing that I thought God was leading me into. And so we turn away, we run from the place that God had called us to. And that's what Joseph does not do. He stays there. That's when we need to exercise our faith. Trust that God is really in control. He's really leading us, even when everything seems crazy. Just like Joseph had been given this vision, even at the beginning of his life, that eventually he would be this great ruler. And actually his family would come and serve him. He would be set in authority over his own family. Now, in the beginning of his life, he let that get him really, a big head, get all puffed up. Oh, it's all about me and my Ferrari. But later on in his life, he realized that wasn't about him at all. It was about whether he would trust God so that God could use him to save lives. God could use him to save lives. Your second point for the bulletin, and here's the big idea we want to think about. We're going to talk about for a minute about God's sovereignty. God is sovereign, God is in control, and God rules over the flood. Now, I'm saying the same thing 3 times here in different ways so that we can try to grab on to what it means, because this is actually a huge part of what the Bible is trying to communicate to us, not just in the story of Joseph, but throughout the whole Bible. And this is something human beings, we've misunderstood many, many times, and it's not a complicated idea, but it's not as simple or straightforward as it seems. So let's talk about it for a minute. What does it mean if we say that God is sovereign? Well, a sovereign is a ruler. A sovereign is a king. So what we're saying when we say God is sovereign over the world, over the universe, is that God is the king. He is the one who's in control. He rules over the flood. But it doesn't mean that God controls what human beings do. And that's where things get really messy. God is in control over everything that happens. He's in control over the weather. He's in control over, the earth continuing to spin. He's in control over the sun, rising. That's the same thing. He's in control over everything physical that happens in the universe. And he controls that very directly. But when it comes to human beings, God does not control what you or I do. He doesn't make us do stuff. He allows us to choose. We can choose to follow him and have life. We can choose to turn away from him and walk into darkness and death. And he lets that be. So it's clear as we live in this world, if you think about your life and the people around you for a moment, that human beings have what we would call today free will. Everybody nod if you think you have free will. It's kind of funny because I just made you nod, right? Did you choose to do that, or did you do it because I made you? No, you chose to nod. Now, there was something that influenced you to nod your head right at that moment. It was me up here saying nod. It was the other people around you. Peer pressure kind of influenced you to nod your head there. But there's still something in you that made a choice, because some of you didn't nod, and you're no longer my friends. No, just kidding. Some of you didn't nod. There's something in you that even though there are pressures on you from the outside, and not huge pressures in this case, I'm not holding a gun to your head saying nod, even though there's pressures on you from the outside, there's something deep inside you that made a free choice. I'm going to go with those pressures and nod along with everybody else. Or, no, I don't want to nod. I don't care if he tells me to nod. Whatever, forget that. There's something that made a free choice in you. So we have these 2 ideas in the Bible that are both communicated very clearly. Do human beings have free choice? Yes. Is God in control over everything? Yes. And throughout history, human beings have looked at that in the Bible and gone, how can that possibly be? How can human beings really be free if God is in control over everything? Let's say that someone in my family, maybe my extended family, is really going the wrong way in their life. they're really making bad choices. What am I going to do in response to that? I'm going to go and I'm going to pray for them. What am I going to pray? I'm going to pray that God would lead them to make better choices. I'm assuming when I pray that God actually has some ability to help people come, or even to bring people to a place where they make the right choice. Well, did they make a free choice, or is God leading them there? So this is something human beings, philosophers, and just people who kind of think that way. Some of you don't think about this sort of thing at all. Some of you think about this all the time, this kind of thing. This is something we've puzzled over for a long time. Is God in control, or are human beings free? And the clear answer of the Bible is yes. Both at the same time. And Joseph is one of the amazing stories in the Bible that show how it works. You don't need to know you don't need to be able to explain it philosophically. You just need to know how it works in real life. And the story of Joseph shows us how it works. So we see in the story of Joseph, human beings making all kinds of choices. Some of those choices are Jacob, the original patriarch of this family, deciding to really clearly favor one child over the others. Is that a right choice? No, that's a wrong choice. That brings evil into the world. We see Joseph choosing to brag to his brothers about this dream that he's going to have. Is that a right choice? No, that's a wrong choice. We see the brothers wanting to kill him and choosing to send him down as a slave to Egypt. Is that a right choice? It's a wrong choice. But then when we get to the end of the story, when we get to the very end of Genesis, of the book of Genesis, chapter 50 and verse 20, we saw it up there. We saw it up there earlier, but let me just read it for you again. This is Genesis 50, verse 20. Joseph is toward the end of his life. Jacob now has died. And the brothers, once again, because Joseph is this big boss, they're afraid that Joseph was only being nice to them because Dad was still alive. And now that Dad's dead, they're afraid Joseph's going to come and get his revenge. And so they do what their family has always done, except for Joseph. They lie. They say, oh, Joseph, Dad wrote this letter to you and said, don't hurt your brothers. Dad never wrote such a letter. And when Joseph sees the letter, he starts weeping because he realizes his brothers don't get it. They don't understand what God has done through all of this. They think God's not really in control, or he doesn't love them. They don't understand. So he weeps for them, and then this is what he says to them. He says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I'm not going to kill you. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me. He's talking about the moment when they sold him into slavery. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. And this is one of those places in the Bible where you could spend your whole life trying to figure out, okay, who made the choice? Is it a human free choice, or is God in control? Humans have free will, or God chooses everything? And the Bible blows up your mind in one verse, okay? Because it just explains the whole thing without even having to explain it. Humans made bad choices, and God intended it for good. You see free will, and you see God in control over everything all at the same time. All at the same time. There's a verse in Psalm 29, Psalm 29, verse 10, right at the end of this psalm. This is a psalm, it's actually a song that the Israelites used to sing. That's what a psalm is. It sounds like a song, and it used to be a song. It's a little weird, but it's spelled all funny. In this psalm, the whole thing is about God's incredible power. It's about God being able to do this, and he can shatter the mountains, and he can blow up the world, and his voice knocks forests down, and everything runs from him when he's angry. He's just the most powerful thing you can imagine. And then at the end of the psalm, it says this: God is enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord is enthroned as king forever. And this is a powerful image to describe what we just talked about. God being in control even though human beings make their own choices. All the choices of human beings in the world, people choosing to do bad things. Many times people choose good things as well. But all over the place, wrong choices, evil intentions in human beings, in our hearts. That's all pictured here as a flood. It's like dark, chaotic waters covering everything and destroying everything. And yet God is over top of all of it. He is enthroned as king over all of it. Even though human beings are making their own choices, he is so powerful that he has the ability to make it all turn out for good in the end. Now, not good for everyone, because if people continually reject him and turn away from him, there's nothing he can do to help them if they refuse his help over and over again. But if, like Joseph, we can continue to trust him and follow him, then no matter what bad things come into our life, God can turn them into good. Now, I know we say that a lot of times, and you know what the problem is we don't really believe it. Let's dig a little bit deeper and look at Joseph here. So, third point for your bulletin. Here we're going to address the question, how did Joseph do it? How did Joseph endure all of this? How did he get sold into slavery by his brothers and not be bitter and just hate life and get depressed and give up? How did he rise to the heights of a business owner and then get thrown into prison for 14 years and not get depressed and give up? How did he not end up angry at God and saying, I'm not following God if this is how things turn out for me? How did he endure? Here's my answer for you today. Bulletin point, allow God to use your pain to shape you. Allow him to use your pain to shape you. Let's take a look at the verses in Hebrews 11 just before the story of Joseph and the stories of Isaac and Jacob. We read these before a few weeks back. We're going to look at verses 13 to 16 here. We're going to come to these again and again as we go through this series. We've already been at them a few times. Listen to this. It's talking about all these different heroes of faith who did amazing things because they trusted God. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things that were promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better one, a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Joseph endured by taking all of that pain and trusting, making an act of faith, trusting that God was going to use that in some way to help him. Instead of choosing to get bitter and angry and focus on what's wrong in life, he chose to use that pain or to allow that pain to shape him into the man he was made to be. The truth is that Joseph was not ready, even though he had that dream at the beginning of his life of how God was going to use him, he was not ready to be used in that way. Because when he saw that he would become a great ruler, God showed him that. He was all pumped about himself. He was all thinking about himself. And a great ruler can't be thinking about themselves, or else they're not great. He couldn't become the great ruler he was meant to be until he'd gone through all of this stuff that made him humble and changed him into a man who could be used to save many lives. So there was a reason God allowed these things to come into his life. God wasn't the one who decided. that Joseph would be sold into slavery. His brothers decided that. But could God have prevented it? Yeah, he could have. God could have struck all his brothers dead instantaneously. He could have prevented the people from showing up right at that moment to take him into slavery. He could have done any number of things to prevent it, but he didn't. He allowed it to come into Joseph's life because he knew that he could use it to make Joseph into the man that he was supposed to be. And this is also true for you and for me. And so we need to allow God to use our pain to shape us into the people we were made to be. And often that takes what seems to us like a really long time. Does 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years sound like a really long time to you? Yeah, some people in here, it sounds like an unbelievably long time, right? Depends on how old you are, I suppose, how long that seems. But the truth is that that's how long it takes because of how messed up we are on the inside. That's how long it takes to shape us into the people that we are created to be. But if it works, then we can actually be used by God to fulfill the reason for which we exist. And there is nothing greater than that in this life. We've got to allow him, but see, it takes that moment. Now put yourself in that place for a minute, because I want to really think about what's going on in our minds and our hearts. You are either thinking about or have just experienced a great pain in your life, a great suffering, a great trauma. Each of you knows what that thing is. At least if you're over a certain age, you do. It's that thing that just takes you out, like we saw in that video, that dagger into Joseph's heart. It's that thing that feels like that. It feels like there could be no recovery from this. This is the most awful thing that could ever happen to me. Why has it been allowed to come into my life? And right there in that place of pain, you have a choice to make. And that choice is, where am I going to go with this pain? Am I going to take the step that says, no, it's awful. I'm going to let the pain wash over me and destroy me. I give up. This is too bad. God has abandoned me. Forget that. I'm just going to live for whatever I can get out of the moment, or just live in a depression because this pain has defeated me. Or am I going to make the choice that says, I have no idea how this could possibly turn out for my good, but I'm going to trust God anyway. I'm going to do things to try and get closer to him. I'm going to believe, even though I can't see how, that God will use this to make me into the person I should be. And I'm going to step by step. It might take you 30 years. I'm going to step by step with his power walk out of that pain and into life. If you do that, you will become something that right now you can't even imagine. You will become a person who can be used by God, just like Joseph, to save many, many lives. Let's pray. We'll continue in worship.